And so this video lesson is the second of our two videos on what it means to divide by fractions. We started by dividing by unit fractions to understand that when we multiply or when we divide by a fraction that looks like 1 over 4, for example, or just generally 1 over a, we find that quotient by multiplying by its denominator. This video extends that idea into what it means to divide by non-unit fractions. And then that same process can be used to divide by mixed numbers, divide by whole numbers, divide by anything else like that. This completes the entire set of what it means to divide by fractions. So first, let's go through a quick review of dividing by unit fractions. And so we said if we're going to divide 1 into 1/3, the question we're going to ask ourselves is, how many thirds does it take to make 1? And we can think about that two ways. 1 is the same as 3/3. So we can say, okay, well, we need 3/3. Or we can think about it as that 1, each one takes 3/3. And so 1 times 3 is 3. And we can split that into thirds as we see it on the picture of the cake there. That continues along, especially if we're talking about something like, well, if we have 3 cakes and we want to divide them into thirds, how many thirds do we have? And this is where it really gets into understanding that 3 divided by 1/3 is the same as 3 times 3, because each of those ones in 3 requires 3/3 to make one of them. We have 3 copies of 1, so it takes 3 times 3, or 9/3 to make 3. And that all, again, is because 1 can be written as any of these types of fractions: 2 over 2, 3 over 3, 4 over 4, 5 over 5, 8 over 8, 12 over 12, 15 over 15, whatever it is that you want to use as your numerator and denominator. If they are both the same, it equals 1, which tells us there are 2 halves to make 1. There are 3/3 to make 1. There are 5/5 to make 1. And that's the basis of dividing by both unit fractions and regular fractions. So let's take our first look into an example where we don't have a unit fraction. For example, if we had 4 pizzas and we wanted to divide them into groups of 4/5 of a pizza. Now, our question that we ask ourselves when it comes to division is, how many 4/5 does it take to make 4? And in order to understand how that works, we have to look at the numerator and the denominator separately. And we're going to start with the denominator. 4/5 as a fraction is based on the idea that it is a group of 4/5. We talked about that very early in this chapter, that 4/5 is the same as a group of 4/5. So the first question is, how many fifths does it take to make 4? And we can do that by saying, okay, well, we know that if we're creating fifths, it takes 4 times 5 groups of fifths to make 4. And now we're going to take the numerator for what we talked about that it means before, which is, how many groups will I have if I split those fifths into 4? 4/5 is a group of 4/5. And we even say it that way when we name the fraction, 4/5. 4 equal copies of a fifth. So if we know how many fifths we have in total, the numerator tells us, break those down into groups of 4, and you will have your eventual answer. And in order to take a large number of things and break them down into groups, we have to divide. So if we multiply the number of pizzas by the denominator to get the total number of fifths, which is 20, and then divide that by 4, we can find out how many groups of 4/5 it takes to make 4. In this case, it's 5. And let's actually draw that out. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. 20ths. Each of those pizzas is grouped into fifths. And now we take groups of 4. Here's one group of 4/5. Here's another group of 4/5. We have the 1/5 that's left over, and then we have 3 from the next pizza. So that's a second group. Here's another group of 4/5. Here's another group of 4/5. And then finally, at the end of that pizza, we have 5. It takes 5 groups of 4/5 of a pizza to make 4 pizzas. And so when we come down to dividing 4 divided by 4/5, we end up multiplying it by the reversed version of that fraction, what we call the reciprocal of that fraction, or the inverse of that fraction. So 4 divided by 4/5, we do that by multiplying it as 4 times 5/4. To give another example of that, what if we have 4 pizzas, or just the number 4, and we want to divide it into 3/8? Well, our fraction 3/8 tells us two different things. It's a fraction based on eighths, and we have a group of 3 of them. So if we find out how many eighths we have in total, and then split those total number of eighths into groups of 3, we find out the number of 3/8 that it takes to make the 4. So we'll show that visually here. We have, here's 3/8, here's another group of 3/8, here's another group of 3/8, another group of 3/8, another group of 3/8, another group of 3/8. As you can see, we have lots. But it's not going to be a clean answer because we have 2 extra pieces of pizza here. So we can't just always count to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 groups of 3/8, 9, 10, and then a little bit extra. So that's why we look at it in terms of that reciprocal fraction multiplication. So in terms of 4 divided by 3/8, how many eighths do we have in total that we're going to split into groups of 3? Well, there are 4 pizzas, each with 8 slices. So we have 4 times 8 total pieces. And those 4 times 8 total pieces need to be divided by 3 because they need to be split into groups of 3. And we break things down into groups by dividing them by that number. So again, 4 divided by 3/8 becomes, in practice, 4 times 3/8. And so that informs the way that we divide by fractions, and that actually becomes our rule. To divide any number by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal of that divisor. And you find the reciprocal by switching the numerator or denominator. We also call that inverting the fractions. Go ahead, pause the video, write these down, and come back when you're ready to move on. So when we divide a number by a fraction, we don't just mean proper fractions. We can use things like 2/3, 1/2. Even dividing by a unit fraction is done by reciprocals because the reciprocal of 1/2 is 2/1, which is 2. We can divide by a mixed number because a mixed number can be written as an improper fraction. So if we had some number n divided by 2 1/3, well, 2 1/3 is the same as 7/3. And to divide by 7/3, we just have to multiply by 3/7. So to divide by a fraction, we multiply by its reciprocal because we find out the number of denominator unit fractions that it takes to make our first number, and we split them into groups according to the numerator. So let's see what that actually looks like when we take 17/20 divided by 3/4. Now we said that we do this by inverting the fraction. The reciprocal of 3/4 is 4/3. And we can't divide by 4/3 because division by 3/4 and division by 4/3 need to give us different answers. So we find out how many fourths there are by multiplying by 4, and then we split them into groups of 3 by dividing by 3. In this case, we can simplify the 4 and the 20 to 1 and 5 by dividing by 4. That becomes 17/15, 17 times 1 and 5 times 3. So what this is saying, this answer, 17/15, is that in order to create 17/20 out of groups of 3/4, it takes 17/15 of that group. Or just generally, that 17/20 divided by 3/4 is the same as 17/15. As we've said in class when we were talking about multiplication, we can't consider multiplication and division with fractions in the same way that we consider multiplication and division with whole numbers. Multiplying by whole numbers makes our number bigger because we're taking lots and lots and lots of copies. Multiplying by fractions, if it's a proper fraction between 0 and 1, you're only taking a piece of the number that you're multiplying by, and your numbers will get smaller and smaller, or your absolute values will, and you will get closer and closer to 0. Similarly for division, because we are dividing by these small things, it may take lots of small pieces to make a large number. We saw that in the unit fraction video if we divided something along the lines of 2 1/9 divided by or 1 2/9 divided by 1/21. And it took a lot of 21sts to make that because it takes 21 to make 1. These are little tiny things we are trying to build other numbers out of. So what you understand in terms of multiplication growing things in whole numbers and division shrinking things in whole numbers does not hold true with fractions because fractions are less than 0. And they are often very small things. So go ahead, pause the video, work on these for practice problems. And when you are ready to move on, unpause the video and we'll go through the answers. So again, division by fractions is done by multiplying by the reciprocal of the divisor, so 7/8 times 20 over 3. We can simplify by dividing by 4. There's a 2, there's a 5, 35 over 6 is our answer. 7/8 divided by 3/20 is 35/6. 1/2 divided by 3/20 now, that's 1/2 times 20 over 3. Simplify the 20 and the 2 to a 10 and a 1, and now that sort of gets rid of the first fraction. 1 over 1 is 1, so our product, which is in fact our quotient, is 10/3. 1/2 divided by 3/20 is the same as 10/3. Going down to the bottom left, 3 1/3 divided by 7/9, we have to convert these to improper fractions, so 3 1/3 is the same as 10/3 divided by 7/9. We divide by multiplying by the reciprocal, so that is times 9/7. The 3 and the 9 can be simplified by a 3. And then when we multiply that together, we end up with 30 over 7 as our final answer to 3 1/3 divided by 7/9. Now that number, 30 over 7, is 4 2/7. Because 7/9 is less than 1, it takes more copies of 7/9 to make 3 1/3 than it does copies of 1. And finally, on the right-hand side, 2 2/5 is 12/5, and 1 1/3 is 4/3. Now we have to divide 12/5 divided by 4/3. And again, we need improper fractions to do this. We can't do it just with mixed numbers, and you cannot use the reciprocal until you create an improper fraction. So then this becomes 12/5 times 3/4. Simplify down using a 1 and a 3, and you end up with 3, or rather, that's backwards. I don't know why I did that. 3 times 3 is 9, and 5 times 1 is 5. So our quotient, 9/5. 2 2/5 divided by 1 1/3 is equal to 9/5. So again, to divide by fractions, you multiply by the reciprocal of the divisor, which really should be called the divisor fraction. And so I'll correct that here. Multiply by the reciprocal of the divisor. That's true whether you're using unit fractions, non-unit fractions, mixed numbers, whole numbers, anything like that. That is the process for dividing by fractions.